The wheezing fluorescent light above me flickered 3 times before steadying itself again, casting a sickly pallor across my weathered hands. I'd been the night custodian at Blackwood Memorial Hospital for 27 years, but something about tonight felt wrong. The air hung differently in the abandoned West Wing, heavier, watching, waiting. I pushed my cart down the corridor, its squeaking wheels echoing against the peeling walls. This section had been closed for renovation after the fire 6 months ago, but budget cuts meant it simply sat here, decaying. My supervisor insisted we still maintain minimum cleanliness standards. Just in case, he'd said, not meeting my eyes. Just in case of what, I'd always wondered. The smell hit me first. Antiseptic layered over something deeper, earthier. Most hospitals have that clinical edge to them, but this was different. It reminded me of wet soil after rain, of things unearthed. I chalked it up to water damage from the sprinklers during the fire. The official report said it started in room 217, but nobody ever explained how or why. My flashlight beam caught something unusual on the floor ahead. Dark smudges leading toward the nurse's station. I'd been through here just yesterday, and the floors had been clean. The marks weren't footprints exactly, more like something had been dragged, leaving inconsistent trails of something. I crouched down, my aging knees protesting with audible pops, and touched the edge of one smear. It was damp, not wet, but tacky, like paint that had almost dried. When I brought my fingers closer to my nose, the earthy smell intensified. Soil mixed with copper, like blood, but older somehow. I wiped my fingers on my uniform pants, a chill running up my spine despite the stuffy air. My radio crackled suddenly, making me jolt. "Carter, you in the West Wing?" It was Mike from security, his voice tense. "Yeah," I replied, pressing the talk button. "Everything okay?" Static hissed for several seconds. "Motion sensor triggered in 217. System must be glitching again. Can you check it out? Save me the walk." I hesitated. Room 217 was at the end of this hall, the epicenter of the fire. Nobody had been inside since they recovered the bodies. 3 patients hadn't made it out in time. The investigation concluded that the door had somehow locked from the outside, though no one could explain how. "Sure," I said finally, throat dry. "I'm heading there anyway." The radio crackled again, but this time no voice came through, just a low, persistent hum that raised the hair on my arms. I clipped it back to my belt and continued forward, following the dark smears that, I now realized with growing unease, led directly toward room 217. The trail widened as I approached, as if whatever had been dragged was getting heavier, sinking deeper into the linoleum. The corridor temperature dropped noticeably with each step. My breath now formed small clouds in front of my face. Impossible for May, even with the AC running, which it wasn't in this abandoned section. I stopped 10 feet from room 217. My flashlight beam trembling slightly against the closed door. The number plate had partially melted in the fire, the metal warped into an unnatural grin. But what froze me in place was the sound, a rhythmic scraping coming from behind the door. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. Like fingernails against the inside of the door. In 27 years, I'd encountered everything from homeless people seeking shelter to teenagers looking for thrills in the abandoned parts of the hospital. I'd seen death in many forms and wasn't easily spooked, but something primordial in me recognized the wrongness beyond that door. Something that shouldn't be here, that couldn't be here. My radio burst to life again, the static so loud I fumbled to lower the volume. Through the white noise, I could barely make out Mike's voice. "Get out, don't, 217, they're not..." The transmission cut off as the lights in the corridor died, completely plunging me into darkness except for my flashlight beam. The scraping behind the door stopped. Complete silence descended, so absolute I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then came a new sound, a wet sliding noise, like something heavy being dragged across tile. But it wasn't coming from behind the door anymore. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam shaking violently now. The dark smears I'd been following weren't leading toward room 217. They were coming from it, and they were fresh, glistening under my light, spreading outward like tendrils. As I watched, paralyzed, one tendril extended another inch across the floor, though nothing visible was pushing it. The overhead lights flickered once, briefly illuminating the corridor. In that fractional moment, I saw them, 3 figures standing between me and the exit. Their bodies were charred beyond recognition, clothes melted into blackened skin. They had no eyes, just hollow sockets that somehow still held an unmistakable focus on me. The lights went out again. My flashlight died simultaneously, the batteries draining in seconds. The darkness was complete, but I could hear them moving. The wet slide of burned flesh against linoleum coming closer. The smell of soil and copper became overwhelming, mixed now with the acrid stench of charred meat. Behind me, the door to room 217 clicked and slowly began to open. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold, slick, and wrong. Its grip was impossibly strong, fingers pressing into my flesh with inhuman strength. It began pulling me backward toward the now open doorway. Another hand found my arm, then another my neck. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as something cold and viscous pressed against my lips. The door to room 217 has always been known to lock from the outside. What nobody knew, what I discovered in my final moments, is that it's not to keep people out. It's to keep something in. They found my cleaning cart the next morning, abandoned in the hallway outside room 217. The official report listed me as missing, presumed quit. My supervisor later told police I'd seemed stressed and paranoid about working in the West Wing. They never searched room 217. Why would they? The door was locked from the outside, just as it had been since the fire. But sometimes on quiet nights, the motion sensor in room 217 still triggers. And if you listen carefully, you might hear the sound of a squeaking wheel, endlessly pushing a custodian's cart down a darkened hallway, never reaching its destination. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more terrifying stories from the darkest corners of our world. Leave a comment below telling us which part scared you the most. We're always listening. The overhead lights flickered once, briefly illuminating the corridor. In that fractional moment, I saw them, 3 figures standing between me and the exit. Their bodies were charred beyond recognition, clothes melted into blackened skin. They had no eyes, just hollow sockets that somehow still held an unmistakable focus on me. The lights went out again. My flashlight died simultaneously, the batteries draining in seconds. The darkness was complete, but I could hear them moving. The wet slide of burned flesh against linoleum coming closer. The smell of soil and copper became overwhelming, mixed now with the acrid stench of charred meat. Behind me, the door to room 217 clicked and slowly began to open. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold, slick, and wrong. Its grip was impossibly strong, fingers pressing into my flesh with inhuman strength. It began pulling me backward toward the now open doorway. Another hand found my arm, then another my neck. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as something cold and viscous pressed against my lips. The door to room 217 has always been known to lock from the outside. What nobody knew, what I discovered in my final moments, is that it's not to keep people out. It's to keep something in. They found my cleaning cart the next morning, abandoned in the hallway outside room 217. The official report listed me as missing, presumed quit. My supervisor later told police I'd seemed stressed and paranoid about working in the West Wing. They never searched room 217. Why would they? The door was locked from the outside, just as it had been since the fire. But sometimes on quiet nights, the motion sensor in room 217 still triggers. And if you listen carefully, you might hear the sound of a squeaking wheel endlessly pushing a custodian's cart down a darkened hallway, never reaching its destination. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more terrifying stories from the darkest corners of our world. Leave a comment below telling us which part scared you the most. We're always listening. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding small against the rush of water. Is someone there? The light stopped its movement instantly. For several long seconds it remained perfectly still. Then slowly it grew brighter, intensifying until it illuminated the surrounding area. That's when I saw the figure holding it. Or rather, the figure that was the light. It had a human-like silhouette but was composed entirely of that same blue-white illumination, like water catching moonlight. Where a face should have been, there was only a darker void within the glow. It stood impossibly on the surface of the rushing water, causing no ripples, unaffected by the current that tore branches from the banks. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. A trick of light on water vapor, an elaborate prank, a hallucination from exhaustion. But deep in my primitive brain, something recognized what I was seeing as ancient and wrong. The figure raised what might have been an arm, extending it toward me in a beckoning gesture. The water beneath its feet began to churn differently, forming a path, a narrow causeway of calm water, cutting straight across the flooded creek to where I stood frozen. That's when I heard it, not with my ears, but inside my head. A voice like moving water, neither male nor female, neither young nor old. You need to cross. I can help you. My phone flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness save for the blue-white glow of the figure. The rain intensified, now coming down in sheets so heavy I could barely breathe, without feeling like I was drowning. Your home is just beyond. Your wife is waiting. Take my path. The voice was reasonable, soothing even, and it was right. My house was less than a quarter mile from the other side. Angela would be worried if I didn't show up soon. The alternative was a 2-mile walk back around the preserve in this deluge. The calm path across the water looked increasingly appealing. I took one hesitant step toward the creek. The figure's glow pulsed brighter in what felt like approval. That's right, just walk the path. I've been waiting so long for someone to help. I paused, one foot hovering above the first step of the submerged bridge. Help with what? I found myself asking. A sound like distant laughter rippled across the water. To replace me. Those words sent ice through my veins. I stumbled backward, nearly falling in the mud. The figure's light flared with sudden intensity, and the voice lost its soothing quality. 30 years I've stood watch. It's someone else's turn. The calm pathway in the water began to churn and bubble. The figure glided forward, now hovering at the midpoint of the flooded creek. With each passing second, its form became clearer. A man in his 40s wearing what looked like an old-fashioned rain jacket and boots. His features were blurred, but his expression was unmistakably desperate. I turned and ran, slipping and sliding back up the muddy path the way I'd come. Behind me, I heard a howl that could have been the wind, could have been the rushing water, but felt like pure rage. I didn't look back, not even when blue-white light flooded the trees around me, casting multiple shadows that moved independently of my own. By the time I reached the preserve entrance, I was soaked through and covered in mud, but the unnatural light had faded. I took the long way home, arrived an hour late, and told my wife I'd been stuck at the office waiting for the rain to let up. That should have been the end of it. A strange experience, a trick of light and stress and bad weather. Something to eventually dismiss or rationalize away. Except for one thing. Every night since then, I've woken at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the sound of water dripping in our bedroom. No matter how many times I check, there's never a leak, never a source I can find. But the dripping continues until dawn, and with it comes a faint blue-white glow from beneath our bedroom door, as if someone is standing in the hallway, waiting. Last night, I finally gathered the courage to open that door. The hallway was empty, but our front door stood wide open, rain blowing in across the threshold. On the welcome mat were muddy footprints, not leading in, but leading out, and a small puddle of water that, when the overhead light hit it just right, glowed with an unnatural blue-white luminescence. The local news reported this morning that a man went missing in Hollow Creek Preserve last night. The police found his car in the business district parking lot, but no sign of him on the main roads. They believe he may have tried to take the shortcut through the preserve, despite the flood warnings. Tonight, I've barricaded our bedroom door. I've told Angela to sleep at her sister's, claiming a stomach bug I don't want her to catch. It's almost midnight now, and the rain has started again. In a few hours, I know I'll wake to the sound of dripping water, and I'm terrified that this time, when I open my eyes, I'll see a figure standing at the foot of my bed with rainwater pooling beneath its feet, waiting to be relieved of its duty, a duty I unknowingly accepted when I almost stepped onto that submerged path. Because I now understand what waits in Hollow Creek. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but a sentry, a watcher at a threshold that was never meant to be crossed, and it's chosen me as its replacement. 3:17 isn't just a time, it's a date. March 17th, 1989. The night the original bridge washed away in a flash flood, taking someone with it. Someone who's been standing guard ever since, warning others away from whatever lies beneath those waters, until it found someone willing to take its place. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying stories that will keep you up at night. Leave a comment below about any shortcuts you'll think twice about taking after dark. We're waiting to hear from you. The house on Morrow Hill had been abandoned for 17 years before I bought it at auction. The listing described it as a handyman's dream, realtor code for structural nightmare. But the price was right, and at 38 with a failed marriage behind me, I needed a project to occupy my hands and thoughts. What I didn't need were the whispers that seemed to follow me from room to room, always just at the edge of comprehension. I first noticed it while tearing out the water-damaged drywall in what would become my bedroom. A persistent murmuring like a radio playing in another room. Distinct enough to catch my attention, but too faint to make out words. I checked my phone, then my portable radio, then walked the entire house looking for some forgotten appliance that might have sprung to life. Nothing. When I returned to my work, the sound was gone. I chalked it up to the old pipe settling or wind finding its way through the gaps in the century-old framework. An easy explanation for a practical man. The previous owners, the Caldwell family, had left abruptly in 2006. Local gossip was vague on the details. Some said financial troubles, others hinted at a tragedy. The realtor had been legally obligated to disclose that the father, Richard Caldwell, had died on the property, but assured me it was nothing dramatic. Natural causes in his sleep, she'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. I hadn't pressed for details. Everyone dies somewhere. By my third week in the house, I'd established a routine. Work my remote IT job during the day, renovation projects in the evening, collapse into my sleeping bag in the one habitable room by midnight. It was during these quiet night hours that the whispers became impossible to ignore. They always started the same way. A single voice, male, middle-aged, murmuring as if reading aloud to himself. The words were indistinct, but the cadence was unmistakably human. Then gradually, a second voice would join in, slightly higher pitched but with identical rhythm and pacing. Then a third, a fourth, multiplying until it sounded like a small crowd, all reciting the same indecipherable text in imperfect unison. I tried everything to locate the source, pressed my ear to every wall, checked the heating vents, even tore up floorboards where the sound seemed strongest. Each time the whispers would fade when I got close, only to resume elsewhere in the house. Eventually, exhaustion would claim me, and I'd fall asleep to their distant chorus. In my fourth week, while removing the built-in bookshelves in the study, I found it, a small door no more than 2 feet square, hidden behind the lowest shelf unit. It had been wallpapered over to match the rest of the room, nearly invisible unless you knew to look. The whispers, which had been particularly loud that evening, stopped the moment my fingers touched the outline of the door. The silence was sudden and absolute, like a record player being unplugged mid-song. Even the ambient sounds of the old house, the ticking of pipes, the gentle creaking of wood, seemed to hold their breath. I should have replaced the bookshelf. I should have called someone, an inspector, the realtor, maybe even the police. Instead, I went to my toolkit and came back with a pry bar. The door wasn't locked, just sealed shut by layers of paint and decades of humidity. It opened with a sound like tearing fabric, revealing a narrow passage that could only be navigated on hands and knees. The beam of my flashlight disappeared into darkness. The passage extended farther than its light could reach. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying a scent I couldn't immediately identify. Not the expected mustiness of a sealed space, but something mineral and vaguely medicinal. My rational mind suggested a forgotten storage space, perhaps accessing the old cistern that had been marked on the property blueprints. But rational thoughts were growing distant, drowned out by an overwhelming compulsion to explore. I didn't consciously decide to enter. One moment I was kneeling before the door. The next I was crawling through the passage, the rough wooden floor scraping my palms. My flashlight cast jumping shadows as I moved, revealing walls that didn't match the construction of the rest of the house. These were older, made of fitted stone rather than timber and plaster. The passage continued for perhaps 30 feet before opening into a space so unexpected I initially couldn't process what I was seeing. It was a perfect cube, perhaps 15 feet on each side, with walls, floor, and ceiling made of the same fitted stone as the passage. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, facing away from me toward the far wall. But it was the walls themselves that defied comprehension. Every inch was covered in text, handwritten words that spiraled in tight, obsessive patterns from floor to ceiling. Even in the limited beam of my flashlight, I could see that it was all the same sentence repeated thousands upon thousands of times. I am not alone in this house. I am not alone in this house. I am not alone in this house. Some areas showed different handwriting than others, some neat and controlled, others jagged and frantic, but all repeating the same 9 words. In places, the writing was layered over older text, creating palimpsests of obsessive repetition, going back what looked like decades. I moved further into the room, my flashlight beam revealing more of the manic documentation. That's when I noticed something odd about the chair. It wasn't positioned randomly, but bolted to the floor, and attached to its arms were leather restraints, cracked and stiffened with age. As the light played across the back of the chair, I saw that something was sitting in it. The figure was motionless, slumped slightly forward as if asleep. I could see only the back of a head, hair gray and overgrown, and the outline of bony shoulders beneath what looked like a bathrobe. Hello? My voice sounded wrong in that stone room, flat, without echo, as if the very air swallowed sound. The figure didn't move. I should have retreated then, backed out of that impossible room and sealed it away forever. Instead, I stepped around to face the chair's occupant. The man in the chair had been dead for a very long time. His skin was drawn tight over bone, mummified in the cool, dry air of the sealed chamber. One withered hand still clutched a pencil, its tip worn to a nub. The other was secured to the chair arm by a leather restraint he had apparently fastened himself. But it was his face that would burn itself into my nightmares. His eyes were open, sunken, but somehow still moist, as if death hadn't quite reached them. His mouth was stretched in a rictus of concentration or agony, lips pulled back from yellowed teeth, and from between those teeth emerged a thin length of what looked like black thread, extending out and down to disappear into the folds of the bathrobe near his chest. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls of text. In my panicked movement, the light caught something I hadn't noticed before. A tape recorder, ancient and dusty, sitting on a small shelf carved into the wall behind the chair. Next to it was a neat stack of unlabeled cassettes. With shaking hands, I picked up the recorder. A tape was already loaded, the play button depressed. I hit stop, then rewind, the mechanism grinding reluctantly after years of continuous play. When the rewinding stopped, I hesitated only briefly before pressing play. A man's voice filled the room, cultured, slightly nasal, with the measured cadence of someone reading prepared text. Test recording 1, April 18th, 1973. I've prepared the chamber according to the specifications. The acoustics are perfect, completely isolated, no echo, no reverberation. If Davy's theory is correct, this should create the ideal conditions for the phenomenon. There was a pause, the sound of papers being shuffled. To summarize my hypothesis, consciousness creates micro-frequencies that bounce off our surroundings and return to us, reinforcing our sense of self. In an environment devoid of acoustic reflection, these frequencies don't return. The self begins to dissipate, but something else might come through instead. Something that exists in the spaces between echoes. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, it was lower, more intimate. Personal note, Eleanor continues to worsen. The doctors offer nothing but pharmacological band-aids. This is my last hope of reaching what's left of her. If I can just thin the membrane between our reality and wherever she's trapped now. The recording continued with technical details about sound insulation and resonance patterns. I fast-forwarded, stopping randomly at different points. Day 7. The silence is penetrating. I've begun to hear what might be voices in the white noise of my own blood flow. Not Eleanor yet, but something. Fast forward again. Day 16. Breakthrough. When I speak the same phrase repeatedly, the acoustic pattern seems to create a kind of opening. I've made contact with something. Not Eleanor. It knows my name. Fast forward. Day 38. It's speaking through me now sometimes. Uses my voice. Says it needs to come through. Says Eleanor is with it, waiting. I've installed the restraint as a precaution. The final recording from what I would later determine was day 43 contained nothing but the sound of breathing and that same phrase repeated over and over in a voice that grew progressively less human with each repetition. I am not alone in this house. I am not alone in this house. I am not alone in this house. As the tape hissed through its final moments, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. The dead man's chest was rising and falling in subtle, shallow breaths. The pencil in his desiccated hand twitched against the stone floor, and the black thread extending from his mouth pulsed like a vein. It wasn't thread. With dawning horror, I directed my flashlight beam at the withered body and followed the black line from his mouth down to where it disappeared into his robes. With one trembling hand, I pulled the fabric aside. The thing that had once been Richard Caldwell had torn open his own chest. The black line emerged from his mouth, traveled down through his throat, and connected to something nestled where his heart should have been. Something dark and glistening that pulsed with its own rhythm, clearly not human, clearly not dead. As I watched, frozen in terror, the thing in his chest cavity unfurled what looked like fine hair-like appendages. They moved with deliberate purpose, manipulating the dead man's lungs, working the vocal cords in that desiccated throat. And then Richard Caldwell's head turned toward me with a dry, crackling sound, those impossibly moist eyes fixing on mine. His mouth moved, controlled by whatever lived inside him, and a voice emerged, not from his ruined vocal cords, but seemingly from the very air around us. "We've been expecting you. Can you hear her? Eleanor is still waiting." The whispers that had haunted the house suddenly surged around me, no longer at the edge of hearing, but deafeningly present. Hundreds of voices speaking in perfect unison. I am not alone in this house. I don't remember leaving the stone chamber. I have flashes of crawling desperately through the passage, of my fingernails breaking against the hidden door as I slammed it shut, of driving away from Morrow Hill at 3 in the morning with nothing but my phone and wallet. I left everything else behind. The house remains unsold. I've warned the auction company, the local police, even the historical society. They all listen politely, then do nothing. Records I've managed to uncover show that Richard Caldwell was indeed a sound engineer specializing in acoustic phenomena. His wife Eleanor had been institutionalized for schizophrenia in 1972 and died there in 1974. Richard was reported missing in 1973. No body was ever found, until I found it, still animated by something that had answered his call from the spaces between echoes. I'm in a motel now, 3 states away, but distance hasn't helped. Each night since my escape, the whispers find me again. First one voice, then many, building toward dawn. And each morning when I look in the mirror, I notice small changes in my reflection, a slight delay in movement, a momentary vacancy in my eyes. And sometimes when I open my mouth to speak, I feel something shift inside my chest, something that isn't me, something that's learning to use my voice. It's only a matter of time before it perfects the echo. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales from the darkest corners of reality. Leave a comment below about what you think was really happening in that stone chamber. We're dying to hear your theories.